Welcome to No Magic Bullet podcast series. You're listening to What's in Your Toolbox, a monthly podcast on mental health. I am your host, Bobby Kay, a comedian, mental health advocate, and executive producer of the documentary No Magic Bullet. What's in Your Toolbox is an honest discussion on mental health. I am 65 years young, suffer from Tourette syndrome, and love doing these podcasts as it always reminds me to practice what I preach. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 23, episode 11 of season 2. We're traveling to Texas to meet a person that I've never met in person, but I feel I know intimately. I was involved with a project called Different Than the Other Kids, and I think my guest was also different than the other kids. And we learned how to turn lemon to lemonade, and the title of this is called Call Us Gifted, and you're going to be so interested on, as through the conversation, we peel back the levels of the onion to see what a fantastic person my guest is. The links to his website, to his personal bio, and potentially his upcoming book will be at the bottom of the show notes. This is a segue from episode 9, a survivor from Irish Lake, because this was Nate Leipziger, a Holocaust survivor, who used his dyslexia to allow him to get through the death camps and then to progress through his life. And it's also a segue from a chance meeting, which is with Jillian Morris, where she talks about being inferior growing up in the residential school system and how she's overcome that. So we are here to meet my friend, Tim Nelson. Tim is an expert problem-solving coach, change agent, global diversity and inclusion ambassador, an author, and inventor. So without ado, I'm going to introduce you to Mr. Tim Nelson. How are you, Tim?
Hey, doing great, Bobby. Thank you for having me on your show. It's quite an honor.
Well, it doesn't have to be an honor, because if we could help just one person, which is the mantra of the show, then we've done our job. And I have a sneaking suspicion that we're going to help more than one person.
I agree.
So let's talk about how we sort of never met but have met, and were introduced by my friend and one of my students in my fly fishing business, Billy Flynn.
So Billy and I worked together at Lockheed Martin. He was the chief test pilot, and I was in charge of solving problems on the F-35 jet that Billy flew. And Billy had a seminar for all the fellows, and a fellow represents less than 1% of the engineering population. He was a fellow because of his pilot status, and I was a fellow because of my problem-solving skills. So anyway, one day, Billy and some other pilots were talking about their respective planes, and I saw that when Billy planned his flight routine for the Paris Air Show, that he planned it from the end of the end of the flight to maintain 3,000 feet from the ground to protect the plane himself and the crowd. So he planned the flight backwards. And of course, you can't fly the jet backwards, but you can go through the thought process. And then he planned it forward. And I coined the term ambidextrous thinking, because when you're ambidextrous, you can use each hand equally well. And in terms of Billy, he could go backwards and forwards. And as a dyslexic, I went backwards and forward too, in order to see two perspectives.
So, Tim, I can tell you that Billy Flynn talked so fondly about you, and he is the one that encouraged me to have you as a guest because you would be a tremendous asset in what's in your toolbox. But for all our listeners who might not be as familiar, the F-35 was the plane that Canada has recently bought, is the plane that the Israeli Defense Force uses. And a couple of months ago, it was the plane that disappeared. So it's a famous fighter jet. I don't know how much they're worth. What are they worth? $20 million bucks each?
$100 million, $100 million bucks. They make about 100 a year.
So there we have this boy. And the other thing that I'm interested with you, Mr. Tim, is that you've done this not from your home in Texas, but all over the world. So when you were working on Lockheed Martin, you were in?
I've worked in over 20 countries and doing the problem solving approaches I use. I work for the biggest automotive company in the world, which component supplier, which was Delphi. And I worked from the CEO on down, and they had 171 plants, 190,000 people, 43 joint ventures, just huge. And then Lockheed Martin, from the standpoint of aircraft and aeronautics, they're the biggest defense contractor in the world. And the F-35 is the biggest military program ever.
And where was that project? Where did you run that project out of? Was it Germany?
No. I worked out of Fort Worth, Texas, and I got to correct you a little bit. I moved from Texas to South Carolina. So right now I'm talking to you from South Carolina, but I was in Texas on the F-35 for 7 years.
Okay, so we've traveled to South Carolina. So as you listeners can understand, this is a very interesting gentleman, and he thanked me for being a guest, but I'm thanking him because this guy had a tremendous pedigree. Actually, if you go to his website and his upcoming book, it outlines 18 gifts that he has, but in respect to the timing, I've asked him to talk specifically about his dyslexia and his dyscalculia, because that is what Nate Leipziger had, and this is what Tim has. So,
okay, can I talk to you just for a second about seeing Billy catch a 6-pound, 7-pound bass in a float tube when you were guiding him? And in my backyard, I've got 12-foot alligators. And many times when I'm fishing, the alligators will eat my fish. And then in my front yard, I've got a bald eagle with a wingspread of 6 feet. So what I wanted to say, if you want to come YouTube fishing in my lake behind my house, it's got a fish. You and Billy are welcome, but you got to watch out for the alligators.
Well, listen, you know what? I was going to talk about that at the end to just show that you're a normal guy that just doesn't sit there solving problems. And I'll have to use your recovery process if I'm going to fish with alligators, because I get nervous with beavers up here.
Okay.
So, Tim, tell me about your website, your upcoming book, and your gifts, the first 3 gifts in the book, and a little bit about your background with problem solving and working at things backwards and forwards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so I'll go through this kind of in the order. My LLC is called 1550, and you can reach it through 1550.com, as you mentioned. So that's the overall. But I always start on the biggest problem at a client, and that's the one. And then as we develop the client skills, we move to 5. And for example, building an aircraft, there are 10 different areas where the airplane is built, and it starts with the wings. So I worked on the biggest problem on the F-35, and then I addressed 5 other problems in wing. And since there were 10 areas that built the aircraft, I introduced 5 per area, which means the 50. So the 1550 is a deployment model. And I also developed some intellectual property. Everything I've got is patented. It's a very big patent, and I'm quite proud of it because it went through the patent agency without any questions at all. And it involves IT as well as machine learning. So it's very advanced technology, and it works for anything. It's universal. So
Okay, so let me just then try to lead you to where I really want to get you, since it's my show.
yeah,
What I want to get to, this is called What's in Your Toolbox.
yes,
So before you hit the holy mana of patents and solving problems all over the world and being this tremendous business person, tell me how growing up and your mental health issues helped you develop these tools.
okay. Well, it all started when at home I was in an environment that was terrible. I grew up with bipolar mother, grew up with a family that was very dysfunctional. I was always the kid chosen last for basketball games during our playtime. And then I was also humiliated because our special ed teacher would come to the door, peek through a small window, and that signaled that it was time for me to come meet with her. So I had to get up in front of the class and go through the humiliating experience. Now, I love camp. I was able to go to camp every year because my father worked for the YMCA. So I went free. And in the school system, I was measured with academic yardsticks. But at camp, there were no academic yardsticks, and I excelled and developed 7 transferable skills. And I understand that through reflection on that. And the 7 skills, I'll go through quickly. The first is being creative, and dyslexics are very creative. The second is coaching projects. I bring the creative elements to the projects I coach. The third is running programs, and I ran some of the biggest programs in the world. Then I moved into improving people, knowing myself, understanding what's called interactions, and defining standard work. And I use those same transferable skills when I grew up, and that's what made me a good problem solver. But for example, at camp, I coach kids to ski, to water ski. And the process I used to coach them was one that you'd recognize: keep your arms straight and your knees bent. And when I coach problems on the F-35 or on cars, we use standard work. And standard work is just like hold your arms straight and your knees bent. It's developed from the standpoint of making everyone consistent and able to emulate what each other does to ski or to problem solve.
Okay, so listen, I didn't grow up in a terrible environment. My home was wonderful, but my father was a doctor. My mother was a nurse. I had 5 uncles that were doctors. I had 5 aunts that were nurses. I had cousins that were psychiatrists. But for my whole teenage life, they just thought I was nervous. My grandmother twitched. They thought I was nervous. They thought I was hyper. I too had a bad teacher. His name was Mr. Grant.
Okay.
And he would make fun of my twitching. Nobody made fun of my twitching till I was like 13 or 14. And it was when I was 22 that I got encephalitis that they finally figured out that I have Tourette's.
Yes.
So tell me about did you ever have a formal diagnosis in your developing years of dyslexia? Or maybe you can talk about dyscalculia as well.
Yeah, I'll talk about both. But if you look in the dictionary as what dyslexia is, it's problems with words. Sometimes dyscalculia is defined as dyslexic math. So, for example, I was tested formally, but I was tested from the standpoint of stigmas. And a stigma physically means a tattoo or a brand. And you wouldn't brand a black person, somebody on gender equality, somebody that was the sexual orientation was different, but dyslexic, dyscalculia, we get branded. And if I talk about dyscalculia, here I am as one of the best problem solvers in the world. I can't do math. So I've developed a technique called visual math. And just to show you how bad my math skills are, when I came to work each day, I wrote on the corner of the whiteboard what time it was. And then at the end of the day, I counted on my fingers how many hours I worked. So basically, I had a top 5 set of weaknesses. I didn't have problems as much with stigmas, but I chose to ignore them. So I chose for them to be annoyances, and that was it. And then I followed the path of being gifted and using my dyslexia for gift. And I defined that if I followed a standard process, like I mentioned at camp, hold your arms straight, your knees bent, I found out I was a consistent problem solver. And I called that standard work. So the standard work enabled me to overcome dyslexia. But as I mentioned, dyslexia, I got in a lot of trouble like your teacher, but I got in a lot of trouble from the organization I worked in. And when I disclosed I was dyslexic, that was one of the worst things I could have done, because I went from being the president of the company in a domino type fashion where everybody called me consistent, and inconsistency is the biggest challenge for someone that's dyslexic. The hold your arms straight, bend your knees is standard work. And I discovered standard work solved my problem of inconsistency.
Well, Tim, what I wanted to talk about is that you said a couple of things that have resonated. And since the listeners are listening to what's in your toolbox, they should know that their home environment was fundamental in how they developed as adolescents, and you've identified that. And then there was a misdiagnosis for stigma rather than dyslexia, correct?
Well, it wasn't a misdiagnosis. It's how all dyslexics are characterized. And I discovered that, through being a great problem solver, et cetera, my dyslexia wasn't something that was a stigma. My dyslexia was something that was a gift. And this gentleman named Ronald Davis said the biggest problem with dyslexics were being inconsistent. And I figured out how to be consistent. So I took the biggest problem that dyslexics face, just like the biggest problem, cars or aircraft, and I fixed it. And then with regard to the dyscalculia, I used a process called visual math. So I do math visually, and that makes me superior to some of the best mathematicians in the world. And then from the standpoint of my mental illness, I used a process I defined called recover. And recover has let me manage my mental illness.
Okay, so if you can, because we've talked about, I just want to ask you one question. At what age were you formally diagnosed as dyslexic?
Probably in my 20s, but
in your
but the diagnosis in my mind doesn't count, because they measure you with an academic yardstick, and I couldn't measure up. But with creativity, I went to the top leadership school in the nation in Denver, Colorado, and they said that in terms of creativity, I was the most creative person they had ever seen, and they used the words off the chart. So here they were characterizing me with being the best creative, and then from a logical standpoint, the worst. And what was amazing is they tried to fix my stigmas to make me like everyone else. rather than leveraging my gifts. And I said, screw that. I'm going to manage my gifts. And I started developing my gifts and pretty much ignoring the stigmas. So I don't care about the previous diagnosis because I know myself well and I know what I'm good at, and I'm good at gifts. I'm good at skills. And what differentiates the two is, let's say a gift is being a great athlete. Let's say a skill is being a great quarterback. If you only have a gift and you do not have a skill, then the gift is not tangible.
Right.
So when other authors talk about gift in their books, they may list a few gifts. They may describe a few gifts, but they don't go into gifts and skills. And all my gifts, like the issue with dyslexia and standard work or dyscalculia and problems with math, and then the recovery process with mental illness, those are all originated from problems. And other authors don't recognize that your biggest gift start with your biggest problems.
Okay, so
it's not in the literature.
This is called Call Me Gifted. And before we get to that, listen, we were both in our 20s when we got diagnosed. So through our developmental years, I was labeled hyper. I was labeled crazy. You have mentioned to me in some of our conversations that your mental health presented itself with a couple of things that are very heavy.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to lead you into, feeling inferior. You said you had some manic issues. You were diagnosed bipolar, and on and on and on. So can you talk a little?
Absolutely.
I think the listeners would like to hear that part because.
Absolutely. So I describe the dyslexia stuff as dominoes. And I used to play dominoes in pubs over in England when I lived there. And if you line up dominoes so that they can touch one another, when you push one domino, you have this chain reaction. And my mental illness started with dyslexia. So when I declared to the business that I had dyslexia, they saw it as a problem. I saw it as a gift, and we ended up going our separate ways. But in terms of that domino effect that I experienced through dyslexia, every single domino was related to dyslexia. And I say that dyslexia was the trigger to my mental illness. Now, I was predisposed to mental illness because my mother was mental ill. And my mother killed herself on Christmas Day after talking to me. And she had decided to stop taking her meds. So that takes us to recover. And recover is an acronym that the R stands for receive help. The E, exhibit compliance. The C is care. The O is outline a schedule. The V is venture out. The E is establish purpose. And then the last R is reach for the stars. So it was that process that I developed that helped me manage my mental illness. And my mother stopped going to her psychiatrist, which she didn't receive help. And she felt that she didn't need her meds. So she stopped taking her meds. That's when she got polar. Her dominoes were her husband, who happened to be my stepdad, started a fire in the fireplace on Christmas Day, and he left the dapper closed. So my mom was a perfectionist. We smoked up her house. She called me and said, if you don't come immediately, you'll never see me again. Her psychiatrist had told me that she was very manipulative and not to give in to her. So I didn't give in to her. And I have to stand with the guilt that not giving in to her was the trigger. The last domino, they called her to kill herself. When I got to her house, her husband came outside and said, "Tim, the vacuum hose is gone." And she was in a manic state. She drove her car to her old family farm where she loved to hang out with her father. And she drove down a dirt road. She didn't want anybody to find her, so she covered up her car with brush. And 2 weeks later, coon hunters found her in the woods.
Okay, so what the podcast is about, and why your guest, Tim, is that you've turned lemon into lemonade. We've all had traumatic experiences. I appreciate your transparency. I don't want to focus on it because I don't want to focus on it. It's terrible to do that to anybody. But then
can I tell you a little bit about my mental illness? I told you about my
tell me
mother's.
that before, but then I want to get to your recover because that's key, because that's what you've developed.
Right. But, I just expressed what each letter meant.
Right.
Receive help, exhibit compliance, care, outline a schedule, venture out, establish purpose, and reach for the stars. Now, that was reactive. That was me reflecting back on the only mental illness episode I ever had, and that was in my early 40s. And then just one and a half years ago, I was in my office like I am now. I was planning to have a Skype meeting, and I literally lost my mind. I did not know my name. I didn't know what the phone was for. My wife could not communicate with me, and I could not communicate with her. So she rushed me to the emergency room, and I was in the mental hospital for 5 weeks. Now, what happened was when I went to the hospital, they said that they assumed, a bad doctor assumed, that what I had going on was a reaction to my bipolar meds. And if you remember, the biggest mistake my mother made was coming off her meds. Right. Well, when I went to the emergency room, they took me off 14 of my meds. And that was the worst thing the doctor could have ever done, because I became manic. And in previous episodes, I told you there was one. I was in the hospital 1 week. This time I was in it for 4 weeks. I was hallucinating. I'd walk past a blackboard. One time I'd see all kinds of grotesque stuff with sexual acts and things like that with children and adults. Nice. And then the next time I'd walk past the board, I'd see all kind of inspirational statements made by nurses and patients. And I had trouble separating out what was real and what was not real. And I even thought that they cut my little dog up and threw him to the alligators. And that was very real to me, even though it never happened.
Well, you know what, Tim? Well, I'm going to run out of time. So let me tell you, how did you use your patented, develop, recover to get yourself out of it? And it's interesting that happened to you in your 40s. How did you use recover to get to so that you could be my guest on this podcast?
Well, the recover that I talked about earlier was reflection on the past. Then I had to use recover proactively for this event where I went to the mental hospital for 4 weeks. And I started reaching out to get help. So I used the R, receive help. Right. I was compliant with my medicine, but exhibiting compliance was a trouble this time because all the meds I'd originally taken, I was taking off of them. So I had to reestablish it, and I'm still establishing what the needed meds need to be. And I'm seeing psychiatrists and social workers and others that are helping me receive help, and they're helping me with my meds. But due to mental illness, I've lost 10 years of my work life, and based on my accomplishments, you'd never know it.
Well, listen, that's the reason we're doing this, is so that these people understand that you've turned lemon into lemonades. And we're almost out of time. So I have a BAST, Bob's Amazing Support Team.
Yes.
And you have a TAST, which is called Tim's Amazing Support Team.
Yes.
So tell me about your support team, because that's the basis of everything and why we're both here today. Tell me a little bit about your support.
Well, remember, recoverers receive help, exhibit compliance. The next thing is care. So I started surrounding myself with people who I could care for, because when you're mentally ill, everything's focused on yourself. You don't reach out to help other people. And then in terms of outlining a schedule, I took baby steps. And literally, Bobby, if I wanted to set a goal to go to a grocery store, the first thing I'd do is go out to my car and sit in it. The next thing I'd do the next day, or maybe even a few days later, was crank it. The next thing I did was I cranked it and drove to the store. The next thing I did was I went into the store. The next thing I did was I bought a pack of gum. Those are baby steps that I outlined. And then the next ladder is the venture out. And this is where I set bigger goals. And those bigger goals included going back to work and trying to work again. And then I mentioned the issue of established purpose. And I started establishing purpose by forgetting about working on parts and using my skills for helping people. And then the reach for the stars is what I'm trying to do now in writing the books, the websites, doing all the kind of things that help other people that you can put in my toolbox.
Okay, well, listen, to bookend this, because we've run out of time, I want you to know that when I wasn't well and I had to go to the health club, my psychiatrist suggested I take baby steps, get in the car, come in, go to the health club, come in. So it's the same thing, but we don't see those things as tools. And so I think throughout this conversation, you have been so blatantly honest about everything. And I hope everybody that's listening understands that if you have a bad home environment, you have traumatic issues, whether they be like Tim described or whatever they may be, you have to work hard and it just doesn't go away. There you were, 40 years old, and it was hitting you again.
So can I say one other thing that I think is important to everybody out there? I had 4 people commit suicide in my life. The first was my mom. The next was my best friend in elementary school. The third was a friend, college, and he went to jail. I wrote him in jail. He got out of jail. He started going to church. He met up with a lady that he married. He got a good job. They gave him a truck. He was driving the truck and he got drunk, and his son was in the car with him, or the truck with him, when he got drunk, and they took his son away. And then he robbed a store, a pharmacy, took Demerol and overdosed, and he woke up, they found him with the needle still in his arm. And then my aunt, she shot herself in the heart. And I just want to say that with respect to me and my experiences, there's a very fine line between those that commit suicide and those that don't commit suicide. And I almost crossed that line.
And why didn't you cross that line?
Well, I actually did cross it, but my wife found me before I died.
Okay, well, let's not talk about that. So, therefore, and I don't want to talk about that because we're end of our conversation, and I want to end this on a positive note.
Yeah.
So, your advice to others?
My advice to others is the last step in recover, which is an R, and it means reach for the stars and go back to what you know. I had these 7 transferable skills that I learned at camp, I use those transferable skills with cars and aircraft, and you've got to go back to something you know. I tried to go to farm, and I had no transferable skills that related to farming. So find your purpose, reach for the star, and you will go far.
Well, that's tremendous advice. You've been so honest, because this is an honest discussion on mental health, and you have reached for the stars. And I want to thank you so much, Tim, for talking to us about how you have turned lemon into lemonades, and what a fantastic person you are and as a motivator. And I know that you're writing a book that will be released soon, and we will send that out to, we'll put the link in the bottom of the show notes, and people can read that, or they can visit your website to learn about Recover. So, Tim, we've been on, and it's now time to bid adieu. So this is Bobby Colvin and
Tim Nelson
saying thank you for listening to What's in Your Toolbox. All right, everybody. I got to tell you that was fantastic, because that was really an honest discussion about mental health. And this is a guy that has solved problems all over the world where people that had all kinds of degrees couldn't. And that's because he learned how to do that from just being able to survive and turning it into a gift. He's got many more gifts, but I asked him before we started to just talk about the top ones, because you're going to have to read his book or go to his website to find out the other ones. So I always end up our little session or episode talking about stuff that I've read in the paper. And on November the 1st, on page 14 in the Toronto Star, there was thousands on the wait list for treatment. And it was a discussion about a lady whose daughter had such complex problems that nobody wanted to deal with them. And she actually said her daughter literally needed to be near death before somebody took them in. So Tim and I have been lucky enough that we have developed a support system. And even I'm 68. I'm not sure how old Tim is, but it wasn't like in his adolescence it was his only episode. He just explained to you that it was in his early 40s. So my next guest next month, the last of season 2, is called Collaborative Aging. She's an author and educator, and like Tim and I, have lived experience in developing her tool and helping others. And I know that you will love to listen to her. We have to give equal footing to the aging. Tim and I are the middle of the spectrum, not the autistic spectrum, but the aging spectrum, because most of it's focused on youth and mental health. So if you want
Bobby read that the most productive years of your life are after you're 60, and I'm 61.
Okay, and I'm 60, and I'm 68.
Yeah.
So listen, everybody, thank you so much for listening to What's in Your Toolbox. Tim Nelson from South Carolina. He's going to go out and fight those alligators, and he is a great guest, and I thank him so much.
Thank you, Bobby. Appreciate being on your show, and hope it helps lots of people.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to No Magic Bullet, What's in Your Toolbox. I am not a doctor, but I have lived experience in dealing with the many challenges of mental health. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share with others who will benefit from learning about tools they can use to deal with their own mental health challenges. If we can help just one person, all this effort to bring this podcast to you is worth it.